Thank you so much, Rob. Good morning, friends. I hope that you are good. It might be cold outside, but our hearts is warm. Amen?
Amen.
I am Gerald Afghan, and it's good to be here this morning with you. It's a gift for me, as ecumenical friends, also my bishop, Yvette, that is here, to introduce to you the presiding bishop of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. And that's the Reverend Pumla, Nzimande, and she's ordained minister in the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. And if you look at her profile on the program that we have, that she's not born in 1980, but born in 1982. And we have with us a young prophetic leader. And she comes with huge experiences, not only from the younger age, at the age of 16, listening to the voice of God and responded to the call of God upon her life, but being a young local preacher in the life of the Methodist Church, and even in her younger years as a student minister probationer, has been identified as a future leader in the life of the Methodist Church. She's passionate about education, she's passionate about empowerment, and she's passionate about spiritual formation. Ordained in 2008 in Bloemfontein, her skills just expanded more and more, and being creative in a life of ministry amongst God's people. She is the presiding bishop, the second female presiding bishop in the history of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, after her mother, Purity Malinga. And coming into this role, she is the pastor of all the people called Methodists in 6 countries in Southern Africa, with an estimate of 2 million members. She, in her first address, which some of us here today witnessed in 2023, spoke prophetically and changed the discourse of the people called Methodists, but also the witness within the Southern Africa context. And the theme was awakening prophetic urgency and agency, and reviving the Church of Christ. Not the Church of the Methodists, but the Church of Christ. She continued to focus that how can we decolonize structures, how can we strengthen governance, how can we enhance disciple making, and how can we restore the church's moral voice. And we were here this morning, dynamic as she will speak to us, that she speaks truth to power, addresses corruption and injustices, and stand firm that we as a people of God have a task to do. She comes this morning, and as he will speak about responsible stewardship, we as a flock and as the people have witnessed it in the past years, that how she has started to change the discourse of the Methodist Church, but also for witness, not just in South Africa, not only in Southern Africa, but for witness in Africa and in the worldwide ecumenical church. Today we are honored that as you call all people to be awakened to their calling and to restore their vocation of wherever they find themselves, that the church's moral voice and can be heard, and that the church and the people herself can find its trust in the church again. More than that, she has led the educational department of our church, she has led the lay department of our church, and today we are honored to have our presiding bishop, the Reverend Pumla Nzimande, to share with us. Afterwards, we will have time of questions, and so please take note and have those questions ready afterwards. You're in my hands together as we welcome our presiding bishop, Pumla.
Distinguished academics, colleagues, and guests, allow me to greet you this morning. It is both an honor and a privilege to address you this morning on the topic, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. The Church's role in climate change, food security, and socio-economic justice in South Africa, with a specific focus on responsible stewardship." Please do note that what I offer here is not a formal academic paper in the traditional sense, but rather a series of critical reflections rooted in theological, cultural, and contextual insight. These reflections seek to contribute meaningfully to our shared dialogue on urgent ecological and socio-economic prospects. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for that introduction. The framework that will be guiding this reflection is what Ezra Chitando and Chama Kawunda have termed the theo-decolonial imagination. As Kawunda notes, this approach represents a struggle to conceptualize how pre-colonial African social orders functioned, while critically reimagining the contemporary African Christian experience. Crucially, this is not a call for cultural romanticism or revivalism, but a liberative endeavor to reinterpret life-giving cultural elements in light of present-day realities, particularly those involving ecological degradation, economic inequality, and socio-political exploitation. Our framework is a theo-decolonial imagination that offers us a powerful lens for addressing the interconnected crises of climate change, food insecurity, and socio-economic injustice. This lens provides a framework for African solutions to African problems, firmly rooted in contextual theology and indigenous wisdom traditions. I will employ this neo-decolonial imagination as it offers African solutions for African problems when it comes to the Church's role in climate change, food security, and socio-economic justice challenges in South Africa. And it also speaks on responsible stewardship. Philosophical and theological traditions agree that human beings are moral agents, capable of discerning right from wrong and bearing responsibility for their actions. The call to responsible stewardship is therefore not an undue expectation, but it is a direct expression of human moral agency. In our capacity as image bearers of God, we are entrusted with the care of creation and can be held accountable for both our engagement and our neglect. The Cambridge Dictionary defines responsibility as being in a position of authority over someone or something, with the duty to ensure that things are done correctly. However, terms that are synonymous with responsibility even praise. From this perspective then, responsible stewardship is not a burden, but a privilege. The biblical creation narrative in Genesis 1 supports this understanding. In the order of creation, God created light, the atmosphere, dry grounds and plants, the sun, the moon and stars, birds and sea creatures, land and animals, and then human beings. Humanity is created last and entrusted with dominion over creation. Now the Hebrew term rada, which is dominion, can be interpreted in two primary ways. Dominion, rada in Hebrew. Rada can be seen as ruling with care and responsibility. Rada as domination and subjugation, if you choose to look at it that way. But a more theologically faithful interpretation, as argued by Stephen, aligns with the former. Rada implies an ethic of environmental responsibility, not a license for exploitation. According to Stephen, dominion, rada in Hebrew, rada is an action word which connotes an ethic of environmental responsibility. It is not an authorization for callous disregard of the natural world. And so as we explore this topic of responsible stewardship, a few shifts are critical as we embark on the search for the Church's role in climate change, food security, socio-economic justice challenges in South Africa. A shift from an anthropocentric to an ecocentric view of moral agency is critical. It cannot be that everything is about human beings. And so we need to move from that. A shift from domination to collaboration with the ecosystem becomes necessary for responsible stewardship. A shift from viewing stewardship as burdensome to understanding it as a grateful response to divine abundance is necessary. It is against this backdrop, then, that I offer my thoughts on responsible stewardship, using the theology-colonial imagination and shifting from those things that I have mentioned. movement. Beyond the stage and the limelight, IGOSA promotes the values of the dancing group and has to be exemplary in conduct and character, because unto whom much is given, much is expected. This is never an onerous thing for IGOSA to do, but it is deemed as an honor with the challenge to keep on raising the bar. A pre-colonial image, theo-decolonial imagination. Through this pre-colonial and contemporary image of Zulu traditional dances, we encounter people who are called amagosa, translated into English, stewards. They exercise a form of delegated responsibility over their assigned jurisdiction for the well-being of the entity to which they have oversight. They are not supreme, neither are they meant to be superior. They are one amongst many. They understand their role as part of the bigger scheme of things. The IGOSA does not assume superiority, but exercises delegated responsibility. They lead not for power's sake, but for the well-being of the collective. This is stewardship, not as burden, but as an honor and calling. And it reflects the church's role and the church's vocation, called among the people, not above them, but called to guide with humility and integrity. The church's role in responsible stewardship. The second metaphor that I offer you is the African drum. Beyond its role as a musical instrument, the drum has historically served to capture the heartbeat of the community. Before phones, drums were used to communicate within and across communities. In ages gone by, it heralded important events and ceremonies, for example, births or deaths. A certain drum beat called people together for gatherings and meetings. Certain drum beats called people to unity, action, or sacred observance. Certain drumming rhythms were believed to invite good spirits, and some were believed to ward off evil spirit. It is the drummer who will communicate the message and become the herald, but it is not the drummer who holds the message, but the one who sends the drummer. The drummer in this particular metaphor is not the originator of the message, but the herald of another's call, much like the church, which amplifies God's summons to justice and care. The drum becomes a medium of communal identity, moral imagination, and spiritual mobilization. I've offered you two metaphors. Now let's join the dots and bring these two metaphors of IGOSA and the drum to the church's role in climate change, food security, and socio-economic justice challenges in South Africa for responsible stewardship. Let's join it. Taken together, the IGOSA and the drum reflects the dual aspects of the church's role: to lead responsibly and to speak prophetically. The word church, you will recall, from the Greek word ecclesia, means assembly or called out ones. The church is not a building or the hierarchy, but a community of people belonging to God, as the Laos, God's people. The church is called not only to gather in worship, but to scatter in service. And therefore the call to respond to climate change, food insecurity, and socio-economic injustice is addressed to the entire body of believers. It is a collective and yet also an individual responsibility grounded in theology, culture, and the moral agency of each Christian. And so in the face of climate degradation, growing food insecurity, and persistent socio-economic reality, the church in South Africa must recover its prophetic voice and its role as a faithful steward. Through the lens of the theology-colonial imagination and by drawing on rich African metaphors like the ikosa and the drum, we find that responsible stewardship is not merely a duty, but it is a sacred vocation. To steward creation faithfully is to honor both the Creator and the community. It is ultimately to affirm that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Now, there are many models that seek to define the church, ranging from the institutional model to that of the church as an organism. And there are many in between. But the one model that speaks most directly to the topic at hand is the church as the herald. An image that resonates deeply with that of the drum. According to Avery, the church as herald is best described as the one who receives an official message with a commission to pass it on. The central image is that of a royal herald who comes to the public square to proclaim a royal decree. Now, there is a striking parallel between this role and the pre-colonial function of the drum. Like the drum, the church is called to herald the message entrusted to it by the king. The church, kuriakon, meaning belonging to God, is a messenger of the good news. It beats the drum of life, proclaiming that Christ has come so that we may have life and have it in abundance. This abundance is not a distant utopian promise reserved for the afterlife. It is for the here and the now. And it is for the entire created order. It crosses socio-political, socio-economic, and ecological lines in its pursuit of wholeness. Responsible stewardship recognizes the church's role as both drum and herald in a world longing for liberation from oppression, from inequality, and from exploitation of both human and non-human creation. Tragically, the church has forgotten its prophetic and charismatic calling, and in many contexts has become domesticated. And yet our theological heritage is one of contextual public theology and mission. We come from a lineage that once boldly addressed societal issues such as poverty, oppression, political injustice, and slavery, concrete expressions of the church's vocation. Just as the drum cannot lead itself and requires human agency, the church must actively lead the drum and become the voice of the voiceless. Who are the silenced in society? The list is endless. The environment, the poor, the marginalized, and the excluded. The church is called to beat the drum of liberation and proclaim release to the captives through word and action. And I echo the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why are they falling in. And that time is now. With urgency, the church must become visible at the center of people's suffering, pain, and struggle. It must become the prophetic drum beating loudly for the liberation of the created order. It is in the DNA of the church to respond to the cries of creation, because the parent of the church, God, is the God who hears and responds. A church that does not respond to contextual suffering is irrelevant. It becomes nothing more than just a glorified institution. The church in creation relationships. These move us from pious religion to a liberating one. And so responsible stewardship involves listening to and attending to the cries of the oppressed. And Maltman will affirm that people are suffering from economic exploitation and crying out for social justice. People are suffering from political oppression and are fighting for the recognition of their dignity and rights. Maltman would argue that people are suffering from cultural alienation through racialism and sexual discrimination and are seeking the fullness of a truly human life in solidarity. People are suffering existentially in technocentric, bureaucratic societies, and they seek identity. People suffer under capitalism, dictatorship, racism, sexism, nihilism, driven by a primal fear that breeds aggression. And responsible stewardship must respond. Consider the words of the world scientists' warning to humanity, signed by 1,575 scientists, which states, human beings in the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at risk the future we wish for human society and plant and animal kingdom, and may so alter the living world that we will be unable to sustain life in the manner we know. We are on a collision course. Amongst the many stressed areas is the atmosphere, oceans, water resources, forests, and biodiversity. The church is called to respond to these groanings, and so our mission, our budget, our time, and human resources must be directed towards this healing. Our response as responsible stewards must offer both immediate relief and long-term relief and empowerment to restore the dignity of the oppressed. Responsible stewardship requires us to be a drum that calls South Africa out of apathy. Out of apathy on corruption, on economic injustice, on political exploitation. The church must become Igosa, the dance or the dancer who leads and sets the rhythm. People learn from Igosa, they follow her pace and her energy, and responsible stewardship calls us to that. The church must disturb the systems and structures that bring harm to the created order. Here, Professor Pumla, when he says the church has no alternative but to be involved in the processes of transformation taking place within society. To do otherwise will be detrimental to its mission in the world, and in effect the church will become an irrelevant institution. But the Igosa leads the dance and life. God was revered as omnipresent, and life itself was an act of worship and an act of faith. And therefore, responsible stewardship happens when there is a recognition that humans form part of this household. There are other parts, and all of life is interrelated. It is the circle of life, and not the pyramid of life. And in this circle of life, the principles of oikonomia, the management and dispensation of the resources of God's household, must be monitored for sustainability. And so there remains a necessity for humans and ecology to symbiotically serve one another and cease to be on a collision course. Is this then not what the Greek philosophers would call koinonia? The Webster Dictionary defines koinonia as the intimate spiritual communion and participative sharing in common religious and spiritual community. And we have limited koinonia to the fellowship with God. We've limited it to something just mystical and limited to the spiritual. But koinonia is more than fellowship with God and other believers. It incorporates fellowship with nature, the environment, as an entity in the household of God. Stewardship happens when humans see themselves as part of the ecosystem, not at the top, but within the circle of life. And this is oikonomia, the management of God's household, and it must be ethical and sustainable. In African thought, nature dances to the tune of God's song. Nature is not just something to be abused, exploited, and manipulated through processes that enrich us. It is to be respected as a sibling in the household of God. Here there is fellowship between the Creator and the created. It is for this reason that some African tribes have a special way of even slaughtering animals because of this sacred interconnectedness. They burn incense and speak to the animal and ancestors before they slaughter, because all things are connected and there is fellowship. That is why an African will shake umqombothi from ukhamba. They will shake it and swirl it around, giving thanks to Umveli God for food and drink before they embrace it. Animals and nature are one with Africans. God speaks through nature. Theology colonial imagination takes us back to that. Rain is seen as a blessing. Illness and death are seen as a dark cloud. Some animals are seen as totems. For example, a snake, Bojola, is a symbol of the presence of the spirit. And funny enough, they always appear at the relevant times. And so responsible stewardship is oikos, oikomos, and koinonia. When the drum was beaten, the entire community stopped and took heed of the message of the drum and complied. The interconnectedness of community would take the message communicated by the drum into their daily lives. It is noteworthy that there was no compartmentalization of life, but the message of the drum was for life in its totality. And the drum had an incredible voice, which the church has lost. Responsible stewardship therefore requires that we refrain from creating little pockets of hell within the view that Sunday will create a small pocket of heaven that we will leave at the door of the church as we process back to the pockets of hell. The Christian faith is not escapism into a bubble of holy bliss. It demands holy indignation that challenges all systems life. The absence of temples or shrines specifically set for worship of the Supreme Being or Great Spirit in the African tradition reflects the lack of limitation or dualistic approach to life. The values, ethics, and gospel imperative must infiltrate daily lives. African's first church is the home, its nature, and its all people. And that is why a lot of African-initiated churches worship in an open field or under a tree, for the world is seen as God's temple. Christ was not worshipped in a synagogue or a church, but wherever he went, he was worshipped, and the world was his parish. In the same way, the church cannot domesticate God because the drum beats in community. It also dances in community, and community is the whole of creation. The interconnectedness of life propels us to expand the gospel message into the entire household of God with a recognition that human beings are part of the ecosystem. To be Igosa and to beat the drum is a calling that comes as a great cost, but it is a sacred privilege. In Zulu tradition, Amagosa are not paid, yet their service benefits both themselves and the community. And that is their diaconia, service as a theological imperative. It is William Temple who once said, "The church is the only society that exists for the benefit of those who are not its members." If the church is to steward responsibly, it must address economic and political injustices. Clemens said, Mark, reflecting on Pope Francis' vision of a church of the poor, writes, "A church of the poor does not just happen. It is the result of choice and commitment. Indifference comes not from lack, but from having too much worldliness." Clemens further argues that the indifference in the face of poverty is not due to a lack of something, but rather having too much of something, and that something in this case is worldliness. The church is too full of desires for convenience, for comfort, for maintenance, which leads to the indifference we see, because tending to the poor disturbs the budget. It takes away our big multi-million rand conventions and events. So the church is full. It is for this reason that Pope Francis, in his Lenten message in 2014, said, "A church of the poor is an emptied church. It is an empty church in which the Spirit can dwell." It is important to note that the African drum is hollow. It is empty on the inside. If it was not hollow, the sound would be muffled due to the fullness. The sound echoes to vibrations within the drum. Responsible stewardship challenges the church to empty itself of corruption, of worldliness, of materialism, empire tendencies, self-enrichment, and maintenance behavior, so that it can reclaim its credibility and prophetic voice. A full church is inaudible as its voice is muffled, and cannot, with credibility, advocate for the poor because we are indifferent. Responsible stewardship, therefore, calls for self-emptying, for service, so that the church becomes part of the solutions and the heartbeat of the millions who suffer. And so, as I conclude, in this paper, I have utilized theology colonial imagination to retrieve African drum and igosa have been used as metaphors for the church's role in climate change, food security, and socio-economic justice in South Africa, with a particular focus on responsible stewardship. I offered you the imagery of igosa in the traditional Zulu dance and the drum as examples of primal living, and drew parallels between these two images and the church's role in responsible stewardship. In this multifaceted paper, I deduced that responsible stewardship encompasses recognition of human moral agency, reframing stewardship as response to abundance, not burden, embracing the church's charismatic prophetic role. I offered to us that an understanding of humanity as part of the ecosystem is critical for responsible stewardship. Ethical management of God's household is necessary. Deepened community and fellowship and recognizing the interconnectedness of life with all creation is necessary. And I called us to service, a service that responds to the cries of God's creation. As I conclude, that's what preachers would say 10 times. I'm used to preaching. As I conclude, I offer a lesson again from African culture. One of the first things I was taught as a teenager was cooking. And one thing I grew to know how to do was ukuphala, dishing up the food and serving the food. It was through observing my mother and the spirit of selfless service that I adopted the principles of serving food. Such are embodied and part of the natural rhythm of life. Nobody tells you, you just learn them. And they become second nature as you grow up in community. The main rules when you serve others food is that everyone must have a plate of food. If the food runs out, the person or palayo who is dishing up, who is serving, must sacrifice their own plate so that others can eat. Always make allowances for guests by having leftovers. No one should enter your home and leave hungry. Another important rule: it is unacceptable for one to dish up the best cuts for themselves. It's an unspoken rule. The one serving tends to their own needs last and honors others first for harmony to prevail in the household. There is a recognition that at the point of serving, you hold all the power because you control who gets what. However, as a steward who should act responsibly and care for all, including the traveler, that power must be tempered by a spirit of service. In the same way, humanity has been given dominance on earth and holds the pot. However, the masses will revolt and nature will react if we human beings do not handle economic, political, and ecological responsibility ethically. Thus far, we have failed dismally at this. The pot has arrived. It's ready. For indeed, the earth is the Lord's, and all in it. He made it. The pot is ready.
we can allow, we have about 7 minutes of questions, and even if there's a statement, but if we want to keep it as brief as possible, and with this quotation, the church cannot domesticate God because the drumbeat is in the community. And so if there's anyone that wants to ask a question, we'll take a few at one time. There's one hand, there's another hand to the side, you can move to the side. There's a second hand there, and if there's this side, anybody here at the side? Question, middle? Okay, let us take those to this side, and then we will start.
Bishop Nzimande is this love enough. Bishop is the body processes. Hallelujah. Thank you so much. And you've given us as a church a lot, a whole lot to think about. Throughout your presentation, I have been visualizing the church and looking at what you said and how now as a church we became not stewards but bosses to the other churches. The socio-economic of South Africa, the inequality that you spoke about, it's entrenched in our communities, is entrenched in our churches as a result. There are pastors that are getting paid outside of their communities by the better and richer communities, and therefore, when the dishing up, it is not equal. As a result, the pastor that is receiving is looking at what she gets and then look at her own needs and her own church's needs. Let alone the environment. Let alone the whole community. I'm wondering, Bishop, that because I think it needs to start there, because let's face it, the church is really unequal. The same denomination is what hierarchies. There are buildings that need to be maintained. Therefore, this is how much I'm going to teach for you. So I'm wondering where this whole thing, this ethical stewardship should start.
Thank you for that. Thank you. We got the second one.
Perhaps mine is just to ask, even though there are hints of an answer for it, but in a global context, often African perspectives are overlooked or undervalued. So how might we elevate this African eco-theology in order for us to not have it as an alternative, but rather as an essential voice in the dialogue of responsible stewardship?
We're going to do those two questions, and then we will do another round. Let's at the
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, Bishop Pumla. I hear you talk about the interconnectedness of community. Is it an achievable dream to have interconnectedness in the context of South Africa among the races? Or is it going to be something that we dream about without achieving it? To be interconnected and be able to address the social ills that are in our communities. Thank you.
Yes, the last hand, and then at the back there, then we will do all that together.
Thank you so much, Bishop. Mine is simple. I just want to check with you. The criteria that is used to put a person as a steward. Because in your presentation, I've picked up that not everybody is a steward. And lastly, what do we do? Because I strongly believe that the stewards were elected and nominated by God to be the shepherds in the flock, but not the shepherds of the flock. What then do we do when the steward believes that the flock belongs to steward, not to God, whom we believe is having a sense of ownership towards the flock?
Thank you for your questions, recognizing that conversations continue even during breaks, and some of the answers lie with you as you converse. Let me try to respond to the questions and even comments posed. The first one around the church and how at times clergy uses that space for self-enrichment. It will be very important and critical for us as church to continue using such platforms, ecumenical spaces, because they allow for the cross-pollination of ideas in what's working next door, so that even as we look at ourselves, we do not believe that we are the ultimate. And so I encourage the spirit of ecumenism, because it allows also a space to ask, what is going on in this church? I saw this on Facebook, or this and that, and we are held accountable. There's an important aspect that clergy needs to look at constantly. We have, I believe, moved from seeing ministry as vocation to seeing it as a career. Many ministers see ministry as a career, to enrich themselves, and abuse therefore comes in. So what does it mean to reevaluate our role as clergy? What does it entail for us to come into convocations together and clean our own shoes when necessary? That's what John Wesley would teach us. So that's how I would respond to you, ma'am, and I trust that helps. There's a question around elevating ecological issues from a perspective of an African. And believe you me, the West is looking to us now. And we need to own our voice as Africans. I had many options today on how I could present this, and I decided to own the African voice. If every African scholar did that, I know there are scholars who offer eco-society from a female perspective, a womanist liberation perspective. If every African scholar, every minister can be comfortable with speaking about these cultural elements, because reality is people come to church and they create a little pocket and they make us believe that they do nothing cultural. They go home and they do cultural things and traditions and acts and all sorts. And when we separate that from church, then we have no prophetic voice. When I speak about Nzimande from the pulpit, I can then go to a home and say, don't do this because I have created that connectedness, or do that, or provide guidance and so on, because I've allowed that world to come into the church, but the church to take the upper hand by being prophetic in that space. Remember, Christ was for culture, against culture, in culture, with culture. We have to interact. We can't create a little pocket. There's a question around interconnectedness, whether this is a utopian picture or is this achievable. Reality is privilege so that the one with nothing can have something. I've seen this Facebook game where it's 3 people and usually there's a child and the mom has an Easter egg, but the dad doesn't have an Easter egg. And the child has 2 Easter eggs. So they ask the child, what are we going to do? Daddy doesn't have an Easter egg. What shall we do? And the child says, I don't know. You know what it is? Eventually this child takes mommy's egg and breaks it for daddy, but he keeps 2. In the same way, I think humanity at times we do the funniest things because we want the poor to share amongst the poor, but the rich are untouchable. So if we're going to speak interconnectedness, we have to speak justice issues, we have to speak of sharing resources, we have to go to churches and ask the questions, why white churches resource, black churches, they don't even have a children's Sunday school room and so on. All those questions that are real, we have to speak about those. Then we have the interconnectedness that is real, that is genuine. The steward criteria, once you find the steward, I think essentially it is somebody who understands their ability to build or destroy. It is about the responsible use of power, and that power must be discipled. It must be power that is discipled, utilized in the same manner that Christ would use power. And lastly, I'm hoping if I speak a lot, there will be no further questions. And lastly, there was a quote that I saw just this week, which said, "The sheep spends its life running away from the wolf, only to be eaten by the shepherd." The sheep spends its life running away from the wolf, only to be eaten by the shepherd. The church must be careful of its shepherds and how they build or destroy congregants in the name of God, in the name of shepherd, and how we condone certain actions that entrench injustice. And this goes on to speak of the architecture, the banners we use, the interpretation of scripture, the images we use. Are they inclusive? Do they speak to the young, to women? Do they speak to people in the periphery? Or they just create pious images? So we must be careful because the shepherds destroy the sheep.
Appreciation.